All right, in our second video, we want to think about some of the social problems around environment or environmental issues, particularly around uh, changing climate and human beings' impact on it. So some of the most critical environmental problems that are actually very, very urgent are global warming and climate change. The planet is slowly becoming warmer overall due to the human production of greenhouse gases, and this is causing changes in the overall climate, meaning the average temperature, the way weather patterns react, um, periods of extreme weather. Weather and the environment, we might note, and climate are very different things. Um, so when we see cold weather, that doesn't mean that the climate overall is not getting warmer. And in the next video, we'll look a bit more at pollution and hazardous materials and what we call environmental racism. Now, I'm not really going to deal too much here with the scientific debate over climate change because honestly, there is no debate. The consensus among scientists is human beings definitely are having an impact on the climate. And we can measure that fairly substantially. And we know that changing our behavior would also have a substantial impact on the climate. I'll upload a John Oliver video where he discusses this very issue, but there's one or two scientists out of thousands who study this issue who are funded by oil companies and who say that climate change is just natural changes in climate. They are not even in the minority because their scientific findings have little credible basis. Part of the problem with understanding problems around global warming is how do we perceive of and think of these issues? Right? It seems so large and so apart from our everyday lives that it feels like something that isn't really connected to our own activities and behavior. When we're talking about global warming, what we're talking about is as we put gases in the air from burning fossil fuels like gas in our cars and oil and coal in factories, more and more gases that trap heat stay within our atmosphere. And this causes the planet to gradually warm. In other words, the sun's heat comes in through the atmosphere, but it stays here, whereas before it might have bounced off the surface of the Earth and reflected out into space. So this is causing a slow but noticeable and very important warming to the overall climate of the entire world. And studies have shown, as we'll see in the article by Lee, that just a 2-degree rise in temperatures could have a massive and devastating impact on our entire way of life as a species. Indeed, if we look at this map, we're looking at the projected costs of global warming. So if we want to make this very individual, how do we think about this ourselves? Well, we're talking about the red areas are those that are going to be more deeply impacted in terms of the spending of our gross domestic product, our GDP, what we make, on the impacts of global warming. So what does this mean for us? Well, it means if we have older relatives, we're going to see increasing heat waves and deaths from heat waves. Hundreds and thousands of people can die every year in increasing heat wave deaths. Many of us know the costs of energy go up in the summer because we have to spend more money cooling down our dwellings. And as cities like Atlanta and Augusta cut down more trees for development, not only does this increase gases, but it reduces canopy coverage and increases the amount of heat that's reflected onto buildings, for example. We all know that when we're hot, we're not as productive, that kind of lethargy that comes with it. And studies have shown that productivity does decline during the hottest months. And something we're seeing already is that hurricanes and floods, particularly in these coastal areas of Florida, Louisiana, Texas, are causing increasing amounts of billions and billions of dollars of damage. So increasingly severe weather patterns come along with a warming climate. So we've seen floods in Houston and Florida, many places that are on the coasts of Florida and Texas, for example, are projected to be uninhabitable in the next 30 to 40 years. And yet, of course, some of the wealthiest still try to find ways to live there. And this points us to another problem of the unequal impact of climate change. So, for example, one of the major impacts is that the global south is going to be more impacted than the global north, those countries mostly in green. And this has a number of important impacts. Within our own country, we might note that as certain areas become more uninhabitable, it's going to be the wealthiest among us that are able to find better locations, that can afford the technology and the costs associated with cooling ourselves down, with dealing with climate change. Globally, this is true too. We see that most of these nations in the global south, in South America, Africa, Australia, these are going to be the ones that are most heavily affected by global warming. Particularly, many of their major crops, so a lot of the food we get year-round, will be declining through the 2080s. These are based on computer model projections. And this is true, you might note, in Mexico and the US South as well. It costs more and more to, for example, produce almonds. We have to drain more and more water into it. And it's a very expensive in terms of both ecology and economy. This also brings up some issues of the historical injustice of climate change, that those nations who have been most exploited by these Western powers in the north, who we'll note are mostly up in green over here, Italy, France, Spain, the UK, the US, all of these nations are going to be less impacted by or even positively impacted by climate change in terms of agricultural productivity. But many of the poorest nations who've been exploited by Western colonial powers are going to be dealing with many of the major effects of climate change. And this is why many who try to reach climate agreements try to get these wealthier northern powers to pay for some of the costs of dealing with it. Because after all, much of the pollution in the air was caused by our industrial development.